I'm just delighted to be here, both as an author and of course as a journalist, but also as an Episcopalian. Um, I grew up, like Clark said, in Oregon, in a small town with a church that was really my home for so much of my childhood, and I think that the crew at St. Barnabas, which I know has shared this link this morning, would be delighted to know that I still consider them my home. It's just past 8 o'clock in the morning right now on the West Coast, which means it's the 8 o'clock service would have just started in a normal time. And when I was growing up in Oregon, I often was served as an acolyte for the 8 o'clock service, and I think that the the Father Treadwell, the priest who I grew up with, and Al Kronk, who was so often the lay Eucharistic minister for those 8 o'clock services, and Jenny Olson and the ladies of the Altar Guild would be tickled to know that right around the time of the service starting, I would be here with you one day talking about the struggles of America's workers and the working people who went to church with me and who surrounded me in my hometown and who surround all of us today in our lives. And I think they'd also be both amused and not surprised to know that I was going to start this talk not with high-minded economics or any sort of research or data, but by talking to you about my basement. I've been thinking a lot about my basement lately because along with everything else that's going on in the country right now, a pandemic and a recession and probably the most tumultuous year of politics in the time that I've been alive, along with all that, it's rained a lot in the Washington, D.C. area over the last several months. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river from Washington. And my wife and I own a house that was built in 1920, and we bought it a couple of years ago, knowing that the basement got wet when it rained. Well, this summer it's gotten wet a lot, and despite some of our efforts and some investments in trying to stop that, it continues to flood whenever the heavens open. And so we've been spending a lot of time down there trying to figure out how to shore up our foundation, how to get our basement in a place where it no longer floods, where it is once again performing like you want a house to, and keeping the water out and being a place where people can gather and thrive, and not just a place that accumulates mold and anxiety for us as the rains come. And I think it's actually a very good metaphor for what's happened with our economy, with the foundations of America over the last several decades. We have seen cracks in those foundations. We have seen water flowing in parts of our economy that we used to think of as our true strength. And we have seen a lot of efforts to repair and a lot of promises to repair that have not come to pass. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about what's gone on with the American middle class and that foundation of our economy. And I want to start by talking in particular about what I mean by a foundation of an economy. It's an abstract concept. A lot of people might define it by our market-based system or by the laws that set up that system. But I don't think of an economy that way. I certainly don't think of our foundations that way. I think of our foundations as people, the workers, the women and men who make our economy go. And when I think of those people in particular, it's helpful for me to think of specific examples. And the one who I write about in my book and who I think about a lot, just as a great avatar for the struggles of the American worker over the last several decades, is a remarkable man from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, I know, named Ed Green. I met Ed in the fall of 2013, late summer of 2013, I guess, the final day of the single A baseball season in Winston-Salem. I was down to do a story, and I had brought my son with me, who was 7 years old at the time, and a big baseball fan, still is. And it was a difficult time for us in our lives, in my career, and a lot of things. And I was down seeking some answers for a question that had been really bothering me for really much of my life, but definitely through my entire career as an economics reporter, about why the economy wasn't working for American workers anymore. And I had been charged by my editors with writing a series of stories that would really seek to answer that question: what's really gone wrong for the middle class? And so my son and I were there to meet Ed, who was an example of one of the really debilitating trends that's happened to the country over time. Ed we met Ed sort of ambling down a concourse. He's a tall man and has big hands and a big smile. And when we met him, he immediately started telling my son about all the things he did as a custodian at the ballpark for the Winston-Salem Dash baseball team. He told him how hard it is to scrub Pepsi off concrete, for example, and told him about all the sorts of things people leave behind in a stadium that a hardworking guy has to clean up. He sort of mentioned in passing to my son, and then fleshed this out in subsequent interviews with me, that this wasn't even his first job of the day or his main job. Ed rises every morning, often before dawn, to lay tar on the highways for the state of North Carolina. And in the evenings, back then, he was a custodian or an usher. He worked at sporting events, a second full-time job. And he does that because one job is not enough to give his family a middle-class life. Ed used to have a middle-class job in New York City, where he grew up. He drove a bus and he earned a middle-class wage. But a little after 2000, his mother got sick with cancer. She eventually died, and Ed moved back to the town of her birth, Winston-Salem, to take care of her. He expected to be able to find the sort of middle-class job that he had in New York, but instead what he found was that manufacturing jobs in North Carolina were vanishing, and the ones that were left weren't paying nearly as well as the ones that went away. Ed tried his hand at those, but they had variable hours, and he needed a solid stream of income. So he took his job for the state, and then he started cleaning his church on the weekends as a way to earn extra money. And soon enough, he had 2 full-time jobs, along with his wife's job. And he needed that in order to send his children to college and afford a house and give them a better life. And this is an example. Ed is an example of the type of stress that the American worker has been under for much of the last several decades. All of the income gains that American workers have made since 1980 come down to additional hours worked, economic statistics show us. In fact, leading into this most recent recession, all of the American workers' gains were exceeded by how much extra they worked. So if you took away the additional amount of work that Americans are doing, they wouldn't have gotten ahead at all. Ed is a particularly amazing example of this. He told me in interviews that he got himself a cancer diagnosis at one point in recent years, and he had to get treatments every day, and he'd go in and he'd get treatments, and he never once missed a day of work. He never complained about it. He still doesn't complain about it. His second job is different now. He works at the counter at a liquor store, but he remains stressed by the economy and the inability of a single job to give him what I consider, what I believe we all consider, the aspirations of a middle-class life: the ability to pay for your kids to go to school, for you to be able to retire comfortably, for you to own a home and a car and have health insurance. And so Ed, like so many Americans, was working additionally hard, breaking his back 6 days a week often, just to provide that type of life. Didn't used to be that way in America. And I think, those of us who grew up when I did in the 80s and the 90s heard this as stories, and those who grew up earlier remember this to be the case. In the era after World War II, the American economy delivered for several decades the types of rapid income gains for workers and families that lifted millions of people into the middle class. Jobs paid well, and pay increased, and people could get good paying jobs even if they hadn't gone to college, like Ed, who went to college but never graduated. The American economy had a sort of different compact with the American worker that lasted for decades. And when I was growing up in a largely white town in rural Oregon, we understood that from the way we were taught in school to be a sort of leave it to beaver type situation. That post-war, boys came home, they went to work in their suits, and that, it was sort of this white male delivered prosperity that was the great American middle class boom after World War II. But something happened to that. Something happened to that in the 80s and the 90s and in this century. And I watched it happen in my hometown of McMinnville, Oregon. McMinnville used to be a timber town, and so many of the kids I went to school with, their parents either worked in the woods or the mills or in some sort of industry that supported the timber industry, and they were able to have middle-class lives even if they didn't go to college. And so many of my contemporaries kind of grew up thinking that would be the track for them as well. But that ladder snapped out from under them as the timber industry cratered in the 80s. Oregon, which used to have just a very high concentration of timber jobs, started to shed them pretty dramatically. And a lot of those guys either didn't graduate high school or didn't go on to college after they did graduate high school, and they were stuck in an economy that paid them less for very hard work than their parents had earned. They had prospects for an economic advancement that were far less than their parents had had. And as a kid, I wondered about this. I wanted to know why. Why wasn't the economy working for these guys in particular I went to school with? And as an adult, that versions of that question have haunted me throughout my career. Why isn't the economy delivering new, better jobs to make good use of the workers who have lost their jobs to not just the timber cutbacks, but the automation and outsourcing and manufacturing jobs, or of good service jobs, secretarial jobs, for example, call center jobs. There are so many jobs that used to provide a middle-class wage in the United States that either don't exist or don't pay well anymore. And I have spent much of my career trying to figure out why. Now, one of the wonderful things about growing up and leaving a small town is that it expands your worldview, and you start to understand things that you didn't learn as a kid. One of the big things that I have learned over that time is that the question of when will the economy start to work again is not confined to the white guys I went to high school with. It's confined, it is the full broad universe of a very diverse American workforce. And in fact, the answer for why it's not working lies with that workforce. It lies with what's gone wrong for Ed Green, who I should have perhaps mentioned earlier, is Black. Ed's family is a classic example of what economic research, I have learned over my time as a reporter, shows us to be the great actual story of what built the American middle class, the foundation of our economy. Ed's mother was the daughter of workers at the R.J. Reynolds tobacco factory in Winston-Salem, which provided one of the few good sets of jobs for Black workers in that part of North Carolina when she was growing up, but was dangerous and difficult work. Well, she left Winston-Salem and went north as part of the Great Migration to New York in the 1950s with what was very rare at the time, a sort of business school degree beyond just high school. She got a job for a telephone company. Her husband got a job as a plumber. Those jobs would not have been available to Black Americans for much of the time before the Great Migration started. What had happened with World War II was so many men went off to war that women were called into the workforce, and opportunities began opening for them. Even after the men came back, 30 million American women joined the labor force from 1950 to 1980. And the same was true for Black men. So women of all races start to work in much larger numbers. Black men have opportunities start to be open to them. But even then, before the Civil Rights, on the eve of the Civil Rights Act, the American economy was very much built toward for white men. 95% of doctors and lawyers in 1960 were white men because of the educational opportunities and the sheer discrimination that was holding back women of all races and men of color in the economy. But the hard work of civil rights changed that. And this is the amazing story of the American middle class that we didn't learn when I was a kid, but that I have learned from economic research as a reporter. From 1960 forward, the breaking down of barriers that allowed women who were formerly not allowed to be anything but school teachers or nurses to suddenly become doctors or engineers, that had held Black men back from getting a complete high school education even, or a college education, and then going on to break through barriers in the corporate world. That created an enormous amount of prosperity, not just for those Black families like Ed Green's, but also for the entire country. It turns out that when you have really skilled people and you hold them back, to paraphrase the Sermon on the Mount, when you have all of these lights that you hide under a bushel, and then you pull them out, it just makes the entire economy brighter. And what the research shows us is that it made the American economy grow faster at a time when unemployment was low, and that allowed incomes to grow for everyone across the board. So 40% of the economic growth per worker that America has achieved since 1960, research from economists at Stanford and the University of Chicago shows, is attributable to that better allocation of talent, that moving of Black men and women of all races, and immigrants also, who other research shows to be incredibly helpful for the entrepreneurship and innovation of the American economy. The opening of doors for those workers and the allowing them to defeat some of the discrimination that has held them back, that has been a massive improvement for the American economy. Those workers built the foundation of the American middle class. But then, to get back to the basement metaphor, in the last 40 years, we have neglected that foundation. We've neglected those workers, and in some cases, we've made it actively harder for them to get back. The hard work of civil rights was not finished. We did not equalize economic opportunity in this country. Research from University of Tennessee economist Marianne Wanamacher and a colleague shows that the penalty that you have for being born a Black man in the United States today, in terms of economic mobility, your ability to do better than your father, is the same as the penalty was for a Black man born right when Reconstruction started. It has not improved. We have not improved economic mobility for Black men. This is true in just so many ways. The economy continues to hold back women and men of color, and we continue to hold back immigrants who want to come in and deploy their talents to build our economy better. And so what we saw in the 80s was a war on drugs that incarcerated millions of Black men who otherwise could have been making fuller use of their talents. We saw shifts in the economy that penalized women. In particular, what we should have seen as the economy moved from more of a production economy where we make things and manufacture things, and through the sources of automation and the forces of automation and outsourcing, we moved to more of a service-based economy. Well, that should have rewarded women who are going to college more, attaining skills faster than men across the board in their generational cohorts right now. But instead, our policies didn't keep up. We've continued to make it difficult for women to fully contribute to our economy now, in particular because we have not solved the vexing issue of affordable and available childcare in this country. Women pay absolutely large penalties when they leave the labor force temporarily or for a larger chunk of time to have children, in a way that men do not pay penalties. All of this adds up to an economy where the foundation of our most important workers, those women and of all races and men of color who built our middle class, made us truly different and special in the post-war era, we've neglected them. And this is both a difficult and bad story for us, but it's also an opportunity. It is what we see now in America is a huge group of workers who are being underutilized, who, if we can invest in them and let them flourish, will I believe very strongly, because of the research that I have read and the reporting I've done, they will be the foundation again of a new surge in the middle class. And I was thinking about this a lot when we had some guys into our basement last week to talk to us about the work that we might need to do to shore it up, to get it to a place where the foundation was no longer being threatened so much by all this water intrusion. And we could see, we haven't owned the home that long, but we could see places where other homeowners had tried sort of temporary patches to make things better. They had, sealed up a wall here or tried some paint there. I'll confess that I even did a little bit of it. My son gave me a product a couple years back for Father's Day that is one of those spray things that promises that whatever you spray it on, it will fix it. So I sprayed it on a wall that was leaking, and sure enough, it plugged up some of the leaks, but then new ones just sprouted right in the places I hadn't sprayed. And what the guys were explaining to us was, until you fundamentally fixed the problem, until you have absolutely done the hard work and spent the time and money to truly alleviate the water, you're not going to be able to avoid more and more problems like that afflicting your foundation. And this is true of our economy too. It's true of the people who we need to invest in. We've tried a lot of quick fixes over the last several decades to shore up our middle class. We just came through a period of that where tax cuts and increased federal spending and very low interest rates gave sort of a sugar high for a few years to the American economy. And incomes did grow temporarily, but we haven't seen the sustained, truly fundamental productivity growth over time that would lead to a much more sustainable repairing of our economic foundation. And that was exposed when we had the storm of this pandemic recession. What we have seen are the workers who are so important and so fundamental to our economy have been the ones hardest hit, and they had so little to shield them from that hit. Black men, Hispanic men and women of all races, they have been absolutely, because they are the frontline workers and most likely to contract the coronavirus and most likely to be exposed to job loss because they can't work from home. They have been the ones to suffer disproportionate economic damage from this recession. And they started it in a place where they had far less wealth than a typical comparable white family did. So what we have to do is not another series of quick fixes. I truly believe, and this is a hard thing to say, it's not a good 5-point plan, but I truly believe the very best economic strategy that America could have right now would be to finish the work of civil rights. As we dig out from this recession, as we take the steps needed to keep money flowing to the workers and the businesses that need it to bridge the time until it's safe for people to be out and in a fully running economy again. Once we've done that, we need to get back to work in our individual lives, at a business level, and at a government level, tearing down the final barriers to opportunity, whether intentional or unintentional, that keep Americans from contributing their best talents to the workforce. If we can do that, I believe we have a real chance to rebuild a middle class boom just like we had after World War II. I think about this a lot, actually, in an Episcopalian context. The title of my book, it comes from a prayer book, a prayer in the back of the prayer book, which is one of the ones that, I don't know if any of you used to do this, but when my priest would go on just a little bit too long in the sermon, sometimes I'd flip through the prayer book and just start to read. And what I found is that the Book of Common Prayer is filled with poetry, really, prayers that speak to a much deeper sense of the human understanding than perhaps any particular sermon that I would otherwise be hearing that day could. And one stuck with me and now actually forms the title of my book. It's called The Prayer for the Oppressed. And I want to read it to you now in closing. The prayer for the oppressed goes like this: "Look with pity, O Heavenly Father, upon the people in this land who live with injustice, terror, disease, and death as their constant companions. Have mercy upon us. Help us to eliminate our cruelty to these our neighbors. Strengthen those who spend their lives establishing equal protection of the law and equal opportunities for all, and grant that every one of us may enjoy a fair portion of the riches of this land. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And that's a prayer for people. It's a prayer for the foundation of our economy and our country. And it's also a prayer for ourselves. If we can truly give all American workers their fair portion of the riches of our land, I truly believe our land will be richer and we all will be too. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. And it so resonated with me. You know, my father was a World War II era Black man with a high school education, 40 years as a carpenter, and was able to provide a very comfortable middle-class life for my mom and my two brothers and me. And as you say, that's just not possible any longer. Thank you so much. What a moving and powerful talk. So a few questions. As you well know, it's become an article of faith, even among Democratic voters and Democratic politicians who were huge proponents of it at the time, that a huge part of the reason for the loss of these good paying middle-class jobs was NAFTA in particular and other trade deals like that. What's your take on the role that these trade deals played in this, if any, in your view?
I think there's an important story about trade embedded in what's happened to the middle class, and I talk about it a lot in the book. I spent a lot of time in Ohio when I lived there for 2 years, and then I've gone back to it since then. And you can't spend time in Ohio without hearing about NAFTA and China. I think China, the research shows China has been the big change to our economy. It knocked out 2 million jobs based on a couple of particular persuasive estimates from economists. It also brought us a lot of good things. It brought us, we basically made a trade. We traded those jobs for cheaper and more abundant consumer products. We all have better video games, and the prices that some of our neighbors don't have the good paying jobs they had anymore. I think what's different, we've had shocks like that in America before. And what's different this time is that when, for example, technology made it so we didn't need nearly as many workers in agriculture in the United States, new and better uses of those workers appeared. Those workers ended up in factories where they could earn more money, and while it was dangerous work, could do even more to contribute to the growth of the U.S. economy. That has not happened. I mean, there are laid off manufacturing workers. There are people like Ed Green who looked into a manufacturing job, who just simply have not found better uses of their talents. The better jobs haven't appeared. And so I think a big part of the American story is, why were policymakers not better equipped to anticipate that those possible disruptions would happen? Why haven't we done more for those workers? And why haven't we done more to empower the people who I believe would create those jobs? I think, and in this case, I am in particular talking about women. We have a vast sexism in the way venture capital and other sort of business startup capital are distributed in the United States. And I think it holds us back from the creation of interesting new jobs and industries even that would be well positioned to put those laid off workers back to work in a more valuable way. I'm an optimist for human labor and believe that there is a lot of good that those workers can do for our economy. So I definitely think we should focus, and obviously our politicians have focused so much on the disruptive force that was, China entering the World Trade Organization. But the answer, I think, and where we've really missed the boat is by not spending nearly enough time figuring out, well, where are the better jobs to replace those jobs going to come from?
Right. Let's talk for a minute about unions. It seems that they're both a symptom and a cause of what we're talking about. Can you comment on that?
Well, the period in which the middle class boomed was a much more unionized period in the United States. My book actually, the first chapter opens with a union, sort of a union action in the R.J. Reynolds tobacco plant, led by Black women during World War II. So there is a big part of the story of the post-war boom that unions played. It's also true that the changes in the U.S. economy over the last several decades have just naturally moved sort of the economy away from what has historically been the unionized production sectors and into the service sectors, which have not been as well unionized. Um, so, so I think that there are ways to recapture some of the gains that workers made through unionization. Some of those, obviously, unions have pushed very hard for more coverage of service sector workers. But it's also true that you can get a lot of the benefits of better bargaining power for workers simply by running a hot economy for a really long time. If the economy is growing fast and unemployment is low, and it's doing so in a sustainable way through productivity gains and not an unsustainable way through high deficits and sort of unconventional monetary policy, then I think you have a real chance for workers to demand to be paid what they're worth. And we saw a little bit of that in the 3 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, before the pandemic hit. And we saw a lot of that in the late 1990s, which is the one really good time for workers that we've had since the post-war era. So yeah, I think that a hot economy with bargaining power for workers is a big part of this sort of story that I'm trying to tell of how we can make things better for everyone.
Well, here's a question that's not meant to be political or partisan at all. I really ask it in a clinical way, but the white working class has drifted over the decades from, generally speaking, the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Is there a rationale for that in terms of the core of Republican policies, or is that counterintuitive given what those policies are?
I think it's interesting to note a couple of things about the drift of the white working class over the last few cycles in particular. One is that those workers really have been left behind by the economy. If you think of white men without college degrees, the economists who did that study I mentioned earlier that has quantified the benefits, the gains to the economy from better allocation of talent for women and for Black men. I was talking with one of the authors of that study and about sort of what's changed since it published, and he said, the economy has really clearly started to treat white men without college degrees in that same left behind, underutilized bucket, like almost as if they are a historical minority group now, compared to white men with college degrees. Guys like me, I in fact name myself in the book as sort of a member of the villain class of this. But I think that's an important thing to note. I also think it's important to note that the white working class has dramatically different experiences with sort of how it has dealt with the last two recessions, and in particular the 2008 financial crisis, compared to other groups of workers who were hit hard. They got much more pessimistic. Black workers, Latino workers, many of whom didn't necessarily feel like they had achieved the American dream yet. They saw that 2008 recession as knocking them back in their pursuit, but that they were still on the path. Whereas a lot of white men, and particularly in the industrial Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, places that have been very important politically, those men felt like they had achieved a version of the American dream and it had been taken away from them. And psychologists and economists talk about that as being two very different phenomenon. And I think that has been important for politics, that it has sort of had a different reaction on those sets of workers. Now I'll say a final thing I will say is that those workers were failed by the media in 2016, myself very much included. We told a story of white working class Americans who were all trending toward a particular candidate in that election. And in our efforts to understand them, we made it sound like they were suffering by themselves. We focused on them so much more than we focused on struggling Black workers or struggling immigrant workers, any sort of struggling workers of color. And so we gave them this idea that in a susceptibility to an argument that the workers who don't look like you are actually the ones who took this prosperity away from you, as opposed to you and all those other workers are struggling, suffering together. And I think that's made it harder to make the case that those workers have so much to be gained by banding together and demanding an economy that works for all of them. So I think that is part of the reason that the politics have played out the way that they have is that the media coverage sort of gave a really skewed view of what was actually going on in the economy.
Part of your portfolio at the Times is also to cover tax issues. And so could you talk a little bit about how the tax code is skewed against middle-class jobs and toward the upper 1%?
Yeah, I mean, there's I've read a lot about sort of like nerdery of tax policy that doesn't that you might not think affects the middle class, but I think it actually, the tax code is a way for the country to say what it values and what it doesn't, and particularly what types of work it values. And there's been a longstanding bias among many economists toward this idea that we should tax capital investments, the returns on investment, less than we tax labor, the returns to people working hard. But what I think there's an emerging strain of research that suggests that maybe that's not the right way to look at it, or at least that the bias should not be anywhere close to what it has been. And there's some reasons for that. One is that the people who own capital in this country tend to be the legacy holders of privilege in our economy. White men, and in particular white men with college degrees, but sort of wealthy white men hold a lot of capital in this country. And so when we reduce rates on capital, we are disproportionately helping them, as opposed to the workers who have been trying for generations to build up capital and have struggled to. And so, and then by taxing labor with a different, at a higher rate, I think we are sort of pushing companies to treat labor as differently than they treat their investments. And my view, and that's in the book, and that's actually shared by a lot of economists across the spectrum, is that if you equalized those rates, regardless of what rate you might choose, you do more to reduce those biases and actually get companies to think more of their workers as sustainable investments to make. I'm from Oregon, so I think of all these things in forest terms. But really, companies started a long time, several decades ago, thinking about their workers less as trees and gardens to be planted and cultivated, and more just like, disposable resources that they could chew up and use and then toss away, and they'd go find something else. But I think that the economy and the country do much better when tax policy is geared toward making everyone think about each other in sustainable terms.
In addition to tax policy, another part of the answer surely is education reform. Could you talk a little bit about what you think needs to be done to skew the education system so that workers are better prepared for good paying middle class jobs?
There's so much. We truly could spend an entire afternoon just talking about the ways in which access to good education remains unequal in this country. Outcomes in education remain unequal in this country. I'll just focus on one of them in particular. I think that we have now an economy where a four-year college degree is used as a signaling device to employers in ways that are perhaps not actually helpful, or have very little to do with a person's ability to do that job, and that we'd be better served if we had a much more fluid type of skills training that is not sort of you go to a four-year college, or maybe you get some specialized training that you need at a community college, but with much more focus on two-year programs, apprenticeship programs, different sort of things that the workers can do over their lifetimes, not just in that period right after high school. But if you lose a job in your 40s now, because you no longer have VCRs to repair, and that was what you were trained for, we should make it very easy for you to learn the next thing that's needed for the type of overall skill set you have. Other countries do this better than we do. And so I think rethinking that entire wave of skills training, and this is something that Washington is really great at talking about. I feel like since I got here more than a decade ago, I've covered dozens of blue ribbon commission type reports from business lobbyists and candidates on both sides of the aisle. I mean, I remember Mitt Romney had a very comprehensive plan, for example, in 2012, and the Obama administration talked a lot about it. But it's very hard to get something done, in part because it involves so many different levels of government at once. But it's important. We shouldn't just be divided as a country into people who graduated from a four-year college and didn't, and we should not be divided as a labor market into that.
And final question, and it's relevant to this, green jobs. Many people think that really is a huge part of the solution, that climate change actually poses as much of an opportunity as a challenge, and it can provide lots of economic opportunity to the people we're talking about. Is that your view as well?
My view is that I think that the decarbonization of the economy is an imperative, both in moral and economic terms. We know who is going to be hurt the most by an increasingly warming world. It remains the poor, not just the poor in America, but the poor around the world. They're the most vulnerable to climate change, and so I think there's an imperative to transition the economy to deal with that. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity there. And there's a lot of opportunity in general in solving human problems. We don't, we have misaligned incentives in the economy, and a lot of the great flashy startups that have come online in the last 20 years have been less focused on big human problems like improving healthcare or decarbonizing the economy. Some of them certainly have, than they have on finding new and better ways for us to deliver online advertising to viewers or whatnot. So I think in general, an economy that steers more people toward solving major human problems like climate change is going to be more productive, and it's going to function more efficiently. And I certainly think that if we don't decarbonize the economy, we're going to have a lot of other big economic externalities that we're going to have to deal with that are going to hold back everybody.